Hey guys, this is Sebastian Natural Mystic Pollock bringing you a quick theory video about when we should Cbet for RakebackDollars.com. Before we determine whether our villain's calling range is elastic or inelastic, first we need to define the terms. If our opponent's call depends on our bet size, they have an elastic calling range. An example of this would be if an opponent only calls, if they call a flop bet of less than 60% with any piece, but over 60% they only call with top pair or better, their calling range would be considered elastic. If their calling range depends on the board texture in our range, their calling range would be considered inelastic. Typically, weaker opponents have elastic calling ranges. So it's very important to understand how their calling ranges work and what the best possible way to exploit those ranges is. So as a basic example, let's take a very typical opponent that we run across quite often, the weaker stationy type opponent who will call the flop with any piece of the board, any pair on the board, or if they have any pair in their hand, but only continues on the turn with top pair or better. What's the best exploitable strategy against those type of opponents? Well, first we have to determine our hand strength to determine what the best strategy is going to be. If we have a value hand against this opponent, we want to be betting as big as possible against this villain. As typically, I would recommend as close to pot as possible against this villain because we know that they're going to call with any piece. Then on the turn, we're going to want to bet as close to pot as we think villain will. We're going to want to bet again. Pretty much, I'd recommend as close to pot again. Now, the reason being is we know that this opponent is calling everything on the flop. So by betting big on the flop, we get maximum value from the worst part of their range. If they have any piece, they're calling, so we get maximum value from that. And if they don't have anything, they're folding anyway, so it really doesn't matter whether, we want to keep in their weak part of the range because we know they're calling with anything. Yet on the turn, again, we know that this particular villain is folding with everything but top pair. So if we have a hand that beats top pair, then we're going to want to be betting large again on the turn to get maximum value from their top pair hands, knowing that it doesn't matter if they don't have top pair, they're folding anyway, so we might as well bet big to get maximum value. Conversely, if we're betting as a bluff, we want to do the opposite on the flop. We know that this opponent is going to be calling with any piece of the board and folding with all their air. So therefore, we want to make our bluff as cheap as possible against them on the flop. So if we bet, again, I recommend typically around half pot again in this situation. If we bet about half pot and they call, we know they have some piece of the board because they like to call. Well, now on the turn, we're going to fire again because we know that they're only continuing with top pair or better. So this allows us to, again, on the turn now, bet half pot again because if they have worse than top pair, they're folding anyway. So our smaller flop bet allows us to make a much cheaper turn bet that has a high likelihood of being successful since this opponent calls way too much on the flop. That's just a basic one example of how we can use someone who has an elastic calling range to exploit them. Wet boards are typically more elastic than dry boards. The reason being is if a villain has bottom pair, if the average villain has bottom pair on a on a king 9-7 board, and they have a hand like 6-7 or 7-8 or ace-8 on a that type of board, rainbow, most opponents are going to typically peel at least one street, especially if they're in position. Now, if we take that same 6-7 hand, but now the board is king queen 7 with two hearts, now that opponent's king queen 7, two hearts, and again we'll give them either ace-7 or 8-7 or something like that. Now opponent's a lot less likely to call because, again, there's a king and a queen. There are two overcards out there that we're likely to have. There are straight draws out there. There are flush draws. So they're going to be less likely to call. So maybe on the flop there, with bottom pair on a dry board, they're going to be calling any size bet because they have a piece and the board's dry. But on a wet board, maybe with bottom pair, they'll call a half-size pot bet or smaller. But more than that, they're not going to call, because not only do they know that they're overcards and it's a wet board, but they know that so many bad cards are going to come for them on the turn that are going to help our hand. So, straight cards are going to come, flush cards are going to come, more overcards are going to come. So that's why wet boards are typically more elastic when it comes to calling. We talked about using bet sizing to create leverage. So in the bluff situation where we bet small on the turn, again, or on the flop, to bet, it's going to create a smaller bet on the turn, which again, we're using it to leverage our opponents. And this goes right hand in hand with being able to bet smaller if it accomplishes the same thing. This goes back to one of the earlier slides where we discussed what are we trying to accomplish, and if we have a game plan in place and know what we're trying to accomplish, it's going to make our decision whether we c-bet or don't c-bet much easier. Now, if our opponent's calling range is inelastic, typically, stronger opponents have calling ranges tend to be more inelastic. The reason being is these opponents hand read much better, and they're playing the texture how it relates to our range. So, like we used in the earlier example, if a player is calling us in position and they know a board doesn't hit our range, they're going to be calling with a lot more ace-high hands. They're going to be calling with weaker hands because they don't feel that the boards are going to be hitting our range, and they're going to be looking for spots to take it away on the turn. And typically, these opponents, players who have elastic calling ranges, tend to be more of level 1 thinkers and don't go more into depth of thinking. Basically, what are the cards that I have, and how do they connect with the board? Where people who have more inelastic calling ranges tend to play more dynamic and tend to think on a higher level with level 2 and level 3, as in, I know that he knows that I know type of thinking, and more of just they're thinking about my range and not just thinking about their own cards. So again, against these types of opponents, we really have to formulate a much stronger game plan against them, what we want to do. So a specific example would be if we're playing against a stronger opponent who, on a type of board that we know that this opponent likes to float on, against that type of opponent, I'm either more times than likely, I'm just going to be checking and giving up if I think that this type of opponent likes to float or doesn't think that this board hits my range, or I'm more likely to fire, two multiple barrels at this opponent. These types of opponents, I'm less likely to fire one barrel because, again, if we're playing against an opponent who likes to float, then if I fire one barrel and then check the turn against him, he's going to bet and I'm going to be forced to fold most of the time against them. And so therefore, it's just not going to be profitable, and it's going to be better to check and give up, or possibly check and maybe make a delayed c-bet on the turn. Again, assuming we're playing the hand out of position. Now, if we have a value hand against this opponent as opposed to, a bluff or a semi-bluff, then against this opponent, maybe I'm going to fire a c-bet against them, knowing that they like to call with a wide range, and then possibly I'll check the turn to them to induce a bet from them, where I can either raise them or call, or again, depending on the board texture, that'll determine what my play might be. Typically, we need to understand our opponent much better in order to make the right decision when they have an inelastic calling range. Again, typically, like we mentioned, they are stronger opponents. So we're really going to have a strong game plan in place, and these opponents are going to be a lot more difficult to deal with than opponents who have elastic calling ranges. That's going to do it for this quick video. I hope that this helps on determining whether if we should c-bet or shouldn't c-bet, and really focusing on the difference between elastic and inelastic calling ranges.